I've spent 37 years climbing mountains, chasing summits across 6 continents, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that there are places on this earth where humans were never meant to stand. The Himalayas taught me that truth in a way that shattered everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name doesn't matter anymore, not after what happened on that final expedition, but I need you to understand that I was no amateur when I led my team into those ancient peaks. I had summited the highest mountains, survived storms that killed better men than me, and earned the respect of every climbing community from the Alps to the Andes. I was arrogant in my experience, confident in my knowledge, and blind to the warnings that screamed from every prayer flag, fluttering in that thin mountain air. This is my confession, my testimony to something that exists beyond the maps and satellite images, beyond the comfortable explanations we use to domesticate the wild places. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but the scars on my body and the white streak in my hair are proof that some legends carry truth in their ancient bones. We arrived at the base village in late autumn, when the weather window narrowed to a razor's edge, and most expeditions had already descended for the season. My team consisted of 4 others, each one hand-picked for their skill and mental fortitude, seasoned alpinists who had pushed human limits alongside me on previous climbs. The village elders met us with tea and worried eyes, speaking through our guide in hushed tones about the peak we intended to summit. They called it by a name that translated roughly to the Throne of Silence, and they spoke of the White Guardian that dwelled in its highest reaches, a protector spirit that suffered no trespassers. The old woman, who served us yak butter tea, gripped my wrist with surprising strength, her weathered fingers pressing into my skin as she searched my eyes for something I didn't yet understand. She spoke directly to me in broken English, her voice carrying the weight of generations. Mountain is alive. Mountain is watching. Mountain remembers the old ways. I smiled politely, nodded with what I thought was respectful acknowledgement, and dismissed her warnings as superstition wrapped in cultural tradition. My teammates laughed quietly as we left, making jokes about yetis and mountain gods, treating the sacred fears of these people as quaint folklore. We spent that final night in the village, checking our gear, reviewing our route maps, and drinking to our success with the confidence of men who believed technology and training could conquer anything nature offered. The ascent began under clearing skies that felt like a blessing hour, boots crunching through fresh snow as we established our approach route toward the face that would lead us to the summit. The mountain rose before us like a cathedral of ice and stone, its slopes gleaming in the thin sunlight, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. We moved efficiently through the lower camps, our rhythm perfected through years of climbing together, sharing stories around our small stoves as the altitude slowly pressed against our bodies. But even in those early days, there were signs that something waited in the frozen heights above us. We found tracks in the snow during our 3rd day of ascent, massive impressions that stretched longer than any human foot, pressed deep into powder that had fallen only hours before. The stride length between them suggested something moving with impossible speed across terrain that would have us crawling and gasping. My teammates theorized about snow leopards or burrell sheep, explanations that didn't quite fit the evidence, but felt safer than the alternative. What disturbed me most wasn't the tracks themselves, but the absolute silence that surrounded them, as if every living thing had fled from whatever made them. As we pushed higher into the death zone, where oxygen thinned to whispers, and every breath felt like drowning in ice, the feeling of being watched grew from a subtle unease to a certainty that prickled across my skin like static electricity. The mountain had changed around us, becoming less a geological formation and more a living presence that pressed against our consciousness with each labored step. During our rest periods, when exhaustion should have pulled us immediately into sleep, we found ourselves lying awake in our tents, listening to sounds that didn't belong to wind or settling ice, Sometimes it was a distant vocalization that resonated in frequencies too low to hear but felt in the chest cavity, and other times it was the sensation of massive weight shifting just beyond the thin fabric that separated us from the darkness. My most experienced teammate, a man who had survived 3 different near-death experiences on major peaks, confessed to me during one sleepless night that he felt something watching us from the ridgeline above, something patient and old that waited with the certainty of stone. I told him to rest, to focus on the summit push we would make in 2 days, but my words felt hollow even as I spoke them, because I felt it too. The presence, the waiting, the sense that we had crossed an invisible boundary and entered a realm where different rules applied. The weather turned savage on our 4th day above 20,000 feet, transforming from merely hostile to actively malevolent in the span of hours, as if the mountain itself had decided to test our commitment with elemental fury. We huddled in our high camp, watching the world beyond our tents disappear into a swirling whiteness that erased all distinction between earth and sky, between solid ground and empty air. The wind screamed with voices that almost formed words, battering our shelters with fists of compressed air that made the aluminum poles groan in protest. It was during a brief lull in the storm, when visibility opened like a curtain drawn back for just a moment, that I saw it for the first time, a figure moving across the distant ridge with a grace that defied the terrain and conditions. At first, my oxygen-starved brain tried to process it as another climber, perhaps from an expedition we hadn't known about. But the scale was all wrong, the proportions stretched beyond human dimensions. The figure stood perhaps 9 or 10 feet tall, covered in white fur that blended almost perfectly with the snow, moving with a fluid power that belonged to something built for these impossible heights. I watched it traverse a section of exposed ridge that would have taken me an hour to cross with ropes and caution, and it moved across that deadly space in less than a minute, disappearing behind an ice formation before the whiteout closed in again like a door slamming shut. When I gathered my team and told them what I had seen, their reactions split between concern for my mental state and nervous dismissal wrapped in scientific explanation, altitude sickness, snow formations creating pareidolia, exhaustion manifesting as hallucination. But I saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the way they glanced toward the ridge where the figure had been, and I knew they wanted desperately to believe in the comfortable explanations more than they actually did. We tried to continue with our summit preparations, checking oxygen bottles and organizing gear with hands that trembled from more than just cold. But the routine felt like theater, a performance of normalcy we enacted to avoid confronting what scratched at the edges of our rational minds. Then, our youngest team member, the one who had been most skeptical of the village warnings, discovered the supply cache we had established 2 days prior during our acclimatization rotation. The heavy-duty containers had been torn open like tissue paper, their reinforced plastic shredded by something with immense strength and what looked disturbingly like hand-like appendages rather than paws. Food packets were scattered across the snow, not eaten but examined and discarded, as if whatever found them had been searching for something specific, or simply wanted us to know it could destroy our carefully laid plans. Most disturbing were the marks scored into the rock face beside the ruined cache, deep parallel grooves carved into stone that had been frozen solid for millennia, 4 distinct lines that suggested fingers or claws dragged across the surface with enough force to leave permanent scars. The reality of our situation began to crystallize in my mind like ice forming on exposed skin, the understanding that we had not simply entered the territory of an animal, but had violated the domain of something that possessed intelligence, intention, and a relationship to this mountain that predated human memory by epochs beyond counting. We held an emergency meeting in the largest tent, our headlamps creating a circle of inadequate light against the gathering darkness outside. And for the first time in my climbing career, I heard genuine fear in the voices of people I had trusted to remain calm in every crisis. My second-in-command wanted to abort immediately, to descend while weather still permitted. But two others argued that we had invested too much to turn back, based on unexplained phenomena and stress-induced paranoia. I found myself caught between the arrogance that had defined my entire career and a primal instinct that screamed warnings in a language older than words, feeling the weight of leadership like a stone crushing my chest. We compromised with a decision that felt reasonable in the moment, but would later reveal itself as the choice that sealed our fate. We would stay one more night, reassess in the morning, and make our final decision based on weather and team consensus. As darkness fell completely and we retreated to our individual tents, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the mountain breathing around me, feeling the presence drawing closer with the certainty of nightfall. Understanding too late that some boundaries exist, not to challenge human courage, but to protect us from truths we are not equipped to comprehend. The night that followed stripped away every illusion of safety we had constructed through technology and experience, transforming our high camp into a stage where something ancient performed a ritual of territorial warning that resonated in frequencies both physical and psychological. The sounds began around midnight, not the howl of wind or crack of ice, but vocalizations that came from a throat built on a different evolutionary template, deep resonant calls that seemed to originate from multiple points around our camp simultaneously. They echoed off the surrounding peaks in patterns that felt almost like language, like communication, meant not for us, but about us, as if we were being discussed by an intelligence, assessing whether we deserved mercy or elimination. I heard my teammates stirring in their tents, the rustle of sleeping bags, and the click of headlamps being activated. Everyone, awake and listening to the creature circling our fragile shelter with the patience of something that had all the time geology could offer. Through the tent fabric, I could see shadows moving against the starlight, massive forms that blocked out constellations as they passed, and I realized with a terror that turned my blood to slush that there might be more than one of them, that we might have stumbled into a family group or a gathering of beings we had no framework to understand. Then came the moment that shattered our cohesion completely. A scream from the tent where our communications specialist had been standing watch, a cry of fear and shock that cut off with horrifying abruptness, followed by sounds of struggle and then silence more terrible than any noise could have been. We emerged from our tents into the pre-dawn darkness like survivors of a shipwreck, our headlamps cutting weak beams through air so cold it burned our lungs with each desperate breath. The tent where Marcus had been keeping watch stood partially collapsed, its entrance torn open from the outside with a violence that left the reinforced zipper dangling uselessly, the fabric shredded in those same four-line patterns we had seen on the rock. His sleeping bag lay twisted and empty, still retaining some warmth when I pressed my hand against it, and his equipment remained scattered across the tent floor as if he had been lifted straight up without time to grab anything or cry out beyond that initial scream. The snow around the tent told a story in a language of disturbed surface and massive impressions, footprints that measured nearly 2 feet long, showing a stride length that suggested something moving with both bipedal efficiency and inhuman power. The trail led away from camp toward the northeast, toward a section of the mountain we had marked on our maps as impassable due to crevasse fields and unstable seracs. What disturbed me most was not the violence implied in Marcus's disappearance, but the methodical nature of it, the way the creature had chosen the person on watch, had waited until he was isolated, had executed the abduction with a precision that spoke of planning rather than animal opportunism. We stood in a circle around those impossible footprints, 5 climbers reduced to frightened primates, confronting evidence that we were not the apex predators we had always assumed ourselves to be, and I watched my team's faces transform as the comfortable narratives of civilization fell away like masks removed. Sarah, our expedition doctor, was the first to follow the trail, moving with a determination born from medical training that insisted we had a duty to search for survivors regardless of logic or self-preservation. I should have stopped her, should have exercised the authority of leadership to keep us together, but part of me needed to know what lay at the end of those tracks, needed to see with my own eyes what had taken Marcus from the illusory safety of our camp. We roped together and moved as a unit across terrain that grew increasingly treacherous, following prints that remained eerily clear in the fresh snow despite the wind that should have obscured them within minutes. The trail led us to the edge of a crevasse system that dropped into darkness beyond the reach of our headlamps, and there we found what remained of Marcus. Not his body, but evidence of his final moments painted across the ice in patterns that made Sarah turn, away with a sound caught between sob and retch. His climbing harness lay cut cleanly through, not torn, but severed with something sharp enough to slice through reinforced nylon like thread, and scattered around it were his personal effects, arranged in a configuration that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. But what froze me in place was the blood on the ice, not splattered in the chaos of violence, but applied in deliberate marks, symbols that resembled the cave paintings the villagers had shown us in their warnings. Crude representations of figures with arms raised in either supplication or worship before a towering form. The creature had not simply killed Marcus, it had left us a message, a communication rendered in the oldest language of all, written in sacrifice and symbol to convey meaning across the vast gulf between species. We retreated to camp in stunned silence, each of us processing the implications of what we had witnessed through the particular lens of our training and temperament, arriving at conclusions that range from scientific hypothesis to spiritual revelation. The rational part of my mind that had been honed through decades of climbing tried to construct explanations involving undiscovered primate species or isolated human populations adapted to extreme altitude. But these theories crumbled against the evidence of intelligence and intentionality we had just witnessed. Something in me was changing at a level deeper than thought, as if the altitude and terror and sheer impossibility of our situation had opened channels of perception I had spent my entire adult life learning to close. I found myself remembering stories my grandmother had told me as a child, tales of sacred mountains and threshold guardians that I had dismissed as superstition once I entered the world of Gore-Tex and GPS coordinates and peer-reviewed expedition reports. Now those stories returned with the weight of revealed truth, and I understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that we had not discovered something unknown to science, but had trespassed into a reality that science had systematically trained us not to see. The creature was not hiding from humanity. Humanity had simply forgotten how to perceive what existed beyond the narrow bandwidth of our technological certainty. And now that forgetting was being corrected through the ancient pedagogy of terror and loss. By the time we gathered again in the main tent to decide our next move, I had already begun the transformation that would define the rest of my life, feeling myself split between the person I had been and something older, stirring in the spaces that fear had opened. My team looked to me for leadership, for the decisive action that had always been my trademark. But I found myself paralyzed between two kinds of knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of mountaineering that said we should descend immediately, and a deeper understanding that whispered we had already passed the point where our choices mattered, that we were now participants in something that would unfold according to rules we had not written and could not negotiate. I saw my own uncertainty reflected in their faces, watched them struggle with the same cognitive dissonance between training and instinct, between what we had been taught was possible and what the mountain was teaching us through methods that bypassed intellect entirely. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded strange to my own ears, as if someone else was using my throat to form words in a language I was only beginning to comprehend. telling them we would attempt descent at first light, while knowing with absolute certainty that the creature would permit us to leave only if it chose to, that our survival had already been decided by an intelligence that measured time in glacial epochs and judged us by standards we had forgotten how to meet. That night, as wind howled around our tents with a fury that seemed almost sentient, the vocalizations began again, but this time they carried a different quality, a modulation that my rational mind refused to acknowledge as language, even as something deeper in my consciousness. Recognized patterns and repetition suggesting communication rather than mere animal calls. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to sounds that ranged from subsonic rumbles I felt in my chest cavity to high, keening notes that pierced through the storm like sonar, and beneath the obvious threat I began to perceive something that disturbed me more than simple predation, a tone that resonated with what I could only describe as loneliness, as if the creature was calling across a vast distance, not of space, but of time and understanding. The sound circled our camp in a pattern that took nearly an hour to complete, and as I tracked the progression I realized it was not random stalking but a kind of ritual circumambulation, the way pilgrims walk around sacred sites, marking boundaries between profane and holy ground. Through gaps in the tent fabric I caught glimpses of movement against the star-bright snow, a pale form that seemed to phase between solidity and vapor, and once, just once, I saw it pause on a ridge above our camp and turn its massive head directly toward my tent, and I felt the weight of its attention like pressure against my forehead, like fingertips pressed against glass. In that moment of mutual observation, something passed between us that I have spent years trying to articulate. A recognition that cut through species and epoch to touch something fundamental about consciousness itself, about what it means to exist in a body, in a place, burdened with awareness of mortality and meaning. The creature knew I was watching, knew I was beginning to understand, and in its stillness I read something that made my eyes burn with tears I could not explain, not forgiveness, but perhaps acknowledgement that I was capable of learning. By the third hour of the siege, exhaustion and altitude had eroded the boundaries between waking and dreaming, and I found myself in a state where the creature's vocalizations began to resolve into something approaching comprehension. Not words, but emotional valences and conceptual gestures that bypassed language entirely to communicate in the older grammar of image and sensation. I understood it was showing me the mountain as it experienced it, a living entity with moods and memory, with sacred geometries mapped in stone and ice that human presence disrupted like static across a frequency. I saw through its eyes or memory or whatever organ of perception it possessed, saw the peak across centuries, watched the slow dance of glaciers advancing and retreating, witnessed the few humans who had approached with proper reverence being allowed passage while others who came with conquest in their hearts were turned back or taken as the mountain demanded tribute. The creature was not a guardian appointed to this duty, but an emanation of the mountain itself, its consciousness made flesh through processes that predated human categories of possible and impossible, and its stalking of our camp was not predation but assessment, a testing of our spirits to determine whether we carried the contamination of desecration or might yet be awakened to proper relationship. I realized with a certainty that transcended logic that it had been watching us since we first set foot on the approach slopes, had measured our intentions through senses that read the quality of our attention and the texture of our respect, and had found us wanting in ways that went beyond individual character to indict the entire epistemology of modern mountaineering with its rhetoric of conquest and submission. When Sarah screamed, I was already halfway out of my sleeping bag, moving on instinct before conscious thought could intervene, emerging into a scene illuminated by headlamps and moonlight that carved reality into planes of shadow and impossible brightness. The creature stood at the edge of our camp, fully visible for the first time. and my mind struggled to reconcile what my eyes reported with any taxonomy of known biology. It stood perhaps 9 feet tall on legs that bent in ways that suggested both human and animal mechanics, covered in fur that seemed to absorb and emit light simultaneously, white but also containing subtle iridescence like oil on water. But it was the face that shattered my remaining certainty, because while it possessed features that registered as other, the prominent brow ridge, the wide-set eyes that reflected our lights with a crystalline blue luminescence, the mouth that could never be mistaken for human, there was an expression there, a complexity of emotion and intelligence that demanded recognition as a person rather than thing, a consciousness that met mine with something that felt heartbreakingly like kinship across the unbridgeable gulf of our differences. We stared at each other across 20 feet of trampled snow while my teammates remained frozen, and I felt myself balanced on an edge sharper than any crevasse lip, understanding that what I did in the next seconds would determine not just our physical survival, but something more important about what kind of being I chose to become. The creature raised one massive hand slowly, deliberately, and traced a pattern in the air between us. 3 horizontal lines crossed by a vertical stroke, and I recognized it as the same symbol we had seen painted in blood at the crevasse, the same marking from the village shrine, and I understood it was offering me a choice, a chance to respond with recognition rather than violence, to step across the threshold that separated human from more than human, and acknowledge the relationship our civilization had severed. I raised my own hand, with fingers trembling from cold and terror and something like awe, and traced the symbol back to the creature in the air between us, feeling as I did so that I was signing a contract written in gesture and witnessed by mountains, agreeing to terms I could not fully comprehend, but accepted with a faith that bypassed doubt entirely. The creature's response to my gesture was immediate and devastating. It threw back its head and released a sound that was neither roar nor song, but something that contained multitudes, a vocalization that seemed to originate not from vocal cords, but from the mountain itself, speaking through flesh, and as the sound washed over me, I felt something inside my chest crack open like ice under spring sun. Then it turned with impossible grace and began moving up the slope away from our camp, pausing after 20 feet to look back at me with unmistakable intent, and I understood with a clarity that transcended language that it was demanding I follow, that my traced symbol had been acceptance of an invitation that now required fulfillment. Behind me I heard Marcus shouting my name, heard Sarah crying, felt the weight of my responsibility to my team like chains around my ankles. But something stronger was pulling me forward, a compulsion that felt simultaneously like the worst betrayal and the most important choice of my life. I took one step toward the creature, then another, my headlamp beam catching the prints it left in the snow, 5-toed like human feet but twice the size, pressed deep into ice that should have been too hard to take impressions. And as I followed, I felt the boundary of our camp become a threshold I was crossing in ways that had nothing to do with physical distance. The creature moved up the slope with a patience that suggested it had waited centuries for this moment and could wait centuries more, always staying just at the edge of my light, leading me away from everything I knew towards something my civilization had forgotten how to name. We climbed for what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. Time had become unreliable, stretched thin by altitude and adrenaline, and the cognitive dissonance of following a creature that should not exist toward a destination I could not imagine. The creature led me off our planned route onto a traverse that crossed faces I would have sworn were unclimbable, yet under its guidance I found holds that seemed placed by intentional design, discovered a path that worked with the mountain's geometry rather than against it, moving through the landscape in a way that felt less like conquest and more like conversation. We emerged onto a shelf I had not seen from any of our Reconnaissance, a natural platform protected from wind by an overhang of sculpted ice, and there the creature stopped and gestured toward a fissure in the rock face that my headlamp revealed as the entrance to a cave system. It did not enter, but waited, and I understood this was as far as it would guide me, that what lay inside was something I needed to witness alone. And as I approached the opening, I felt terror and exhilaration mixing in my bloodstream, like oxygen and nitrogen at depth, producing a narcosis of the spirit. Inside, the cave opened into a chamber perhaps 30 feet across, its walls polished smooth by ancient ice and decorated with paintings that made my archaeological training scream with significance. Images layered over centuries or millennia, depicting the creature in various poses, some showing it among groups of humans who appeared to be offering tribute, others showing it standing sentinel over the peak and dominating the back wall, a massive representation that showed it not as separate being but as an extension of the mountain itself. Its body formed from stone and snow and wind made briefly corporeal. Scattered across the cave floor were the remains of previous visitors, bones picked clean and arranged with ceremonial precision around a central altar stone, and I recognized among them the modern detritus of climbing equipment, a 1950s-era ice axe, the remnants of a rope that might have dated to the British expeditions, a titanium crampon from no more than a decade ago. These were not random kills, but specific selections, climbers who had been brought here and judged and found wanting, and as I knelt among the bones, I found myself weeping with a grief that encompassed not just these individual dead, but the entire history of human presumption that had led them to this altar. On the stone itself, someone had scratched words in multiple languages, final testimonies from those who had understood too late what I was beginning to grasp, that we had mistaken the mountain's tolerance for permission, had interpreted its silence as absence rather than patience, and the creature was not guardian imposed from without, but the mountain's own immune response to the infection of our arrogance. Among the writings, I found a journal page preserved by the dry cold, dated to 1974, and read in shaking hands, a confession from a Soviet climber who described the same journey I had just made, the same choice offered and accepted, and his final words burned into my vision. It showed me what I was, and I could not bear to remain that thing. So I have asked for the mercy of unbecoming, to be returned to the mountain as material. The journal page disintegrated in my trembling fingers, its final words dissolving into powder that might have been paper or bone, or the residue of abandoned certainty, and I understood with devastating clarity that the choice before me was not between life and death, but between two kinds of existence. To return to the world carrying knowledge that would corrode everything I thought I knew, or to accept the unbecoming that Soviet climber had chosen, to be absorbed into the mountain's eternal material and released from the burden of witness. I stood on legs that felt borrowed from someone braver and turned back toward the cave entrance where the creature still waited in profile against the star-scattered darkness, its massive form seeming to breathe in rhythm with the wind that moved through the peaks, and I saw now what my terror had prevented me from seeing before, that its posture held no aggression, only impatience so profound it bordered on sorrow, the stance of a teacher, waiting for a particularly slow student to grasp a lesson that should have been obvious. As I emerged from the cave, our eyes met again, and this time I did not look away, forced myself to hold that gaze, despite every instinct screaming that I was staring into something that would burn away the comfortable lies I had built my identity upon. And in those depthless eyes I saw reflected not just my own face, but the faces of every climber who had ever stood on this mountain, a procession of ego and ambition stretching back through decades, all of us convinced we were the exceptional ones, the worthy ones, the ones who had earned the right to stand where we did not belong. The creature raised one massive hand and pointed not at me, but past me, back toward the cave, then swept that same hand across the vista of peaks surrounding us. In a gesture so clearly readable, it required no translation. This is the cost. This is what your conquest leaves behind. This is the price the mountain has been paying for your glory. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I had climbed with respect, had followed protocols, had honored the local traditions with my token offerings and polite acknowledgements. But even forming these thoughts in my mind exposed them as the hollow performances they had always been, the spiritual equivalent of tourists photographing sacred sites while fundamentally treating them as backdrop for personal narrative. The creature seemed to sense this recognition in me because it tilted its head in a gesture that was almost approving, almost gentle, and took 3 steps closer until it stood directly before me, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from its body like standing before an open glacier, could smell something like ozone and ancient ice and the metallic tang that precedes lightning strikes. It reached toward me with that same deliberate slowness, and I understood I was being offered another choice, that if I remained still and accepted what came next, I would receive something, knowledge or death or transformation. I could not tell which, and perhaps they were the same thing. Its hand, because I could think of it no other way despite the wrongness of the proportions, came to rest against my chest directly over my heart, and the cold that transferred through my layers was so intense it bypassed pain entirely and became a kind of terrible clarity, a burning freezing that seemed to reach inside my ribcage and touch something essential. Through that contact flooded understanding that arrived not as words or images, but as direct knowing, the way you understand you are afraid or in love. I felt the mountain's awareness of every footstep ever taken on its slopes, felt the patient tolerance it had extended to humans for generations, felt the subtle damage we inflicted with our passage that accumulated like microplastics in ocean tissue, and I understood that what I had interpreted as wilderness and natural splendor was actually a vast consciousness holding itself in restraint, a power that tolerated our presence the way skin tolerates the mites that live upon it, until the infestation becomes intolerable and the body must respond. The creature withdrew its hand, and I staggered backward, gasping as if surfacing from deep water, my chest aching where it had touched me with a cold that felt permanent, cellular, the kind of chill that lives in bone and never fully leaves. It gestured again toward the path leading down, but this time the meaning was different. Not permission to flee, but command to carry, an assignment of responsibility that I recognized as both mercy and burden, and I understood that I was being sent back as a message, a living warning, the same role those village elders played who had tried to stop us with their stories I had dismissed as superstition. The creature vocalized again, softer this time, a sound that held something almost tender within its alien harmonics. And it occurred to me that this being had been performing this same ritual of warning for longer than human memory, had stood on this threshold between our world and whatever deeper reality it represented, had offered this same terrible gift of understanding to countless climbers who likely responded exactly as I had, with arrogance first, then terror, then this shattering recognition that arrived too late to prevent the journey, but just in time to transform it from triumph to trauma. It took one step backward, then another, moving toward the higher slopes with movements that seemed to phase slightly out of normal space, becoming less solid with each step until I could see through it to the ice wall beyond, and I realized it was not departing, but returning to whatever dormant state it maintained between these encounters, dissolving back into the mountain's fabric like sugar in water. Before it vanished completely, it turned back one final time, and I felt, rather than heard its last communication, a sensation that pressed directly against my consciousness. Remember and make them remember, or I will have to remind them again, and the reminders are becoming less gentle. I stood alone on that impossible shelf as the first light of dawn began touching the eastern peaks, transforming the darkness from black to blue to the pale gold that mountaineers treasure, and the beauty that had once filled me with exaltation now felt like accusation. Each perfect summit a monument to human hubris, each virgin peak an invitation to violation we could not resist. My radio crackled with Sarah's voice, frantic with relief and anger, demanding to know where I was, telling me Marcus had already started down with the remaining gear, telling me to get back to camp immediately because we were aborting the summit attempt. I raised the radio to respond, but found I could not speak, my voice trapped behind teeth that would not unclench, my tongue thick with words that no longer had meaning. Because how could I tell them what I had witnessed when I barely believed it myself, when the language of our expedition, our technical vocabulary of routes and conditions and margins of safety, had been revealed as catastrophically inadequate to describe what this mountain actually was? I began moving down the traverse, following holds that felt less certain now without the creature's guidance, and with each placement of hand and foot, felt the mountain's presence beneath me, not as inert stone, but as living attention, felt myself carried on tolerance that could be withdrawn at any moment, and the confidence that had once defined my climbing dissolved into hyper-awareness of my intrusion into spaces that had never been meant for human occupation. Behind me, the cave entrance gaped, like a mouth in the cliff face, and I knew that the bones inside would be adding to their number soon, that our expedition's hubris had already been judged and found wanting, and that whatever came next would not be accident or misfortune, but consequence. The mountain's immune system responding to the infection of our presence with appropriate force. I descended through air that felt thick with judgment, each breath burning in lungs that seemed to reject the oxygen, as if my body was recognizing its fundamental incompatibility with this altitude, this sacred threshold I had crossed without permission or understanding. The frostbite on my fingers had progressed beyond pain into numbness, but beneath my sternum, where the creature had touched me, the cold intensified with each step downward, spreading through my chest cavity like crystallization, and I wondered if this was how hypothermia progressed, or if something else was happening, some transformation that medical science had no taxonomy for. My vision began fragmenting at the edges, not the usual snow blindness or altitude-induced hallucination, but something more structured, as if reality itself was developing fault lines through which other images bled through. I saw the mountain as it had been centuries ago, pristine and untouched, then watched the procession of expeditions carving their routes upward like scars, accumulating on unmarked skin. The creature's touch had opened something in me, a channel of perception I had never possessed, or perhaps had been born with but taught to ignore. And through this unwanted gift I experienced what the mountain experienced, felt our camps as pressure points of disrespect, our fixed ropes as bindings, our summits as violations repeated so often they had worn grooves into something that should have remained inviolate. I reached a narrow chimney section that required technical movement, but when I placed my hand into the crack, I felt not just stone, but the mountain's awareness focusing on that point of contact, felt it recognize me specifically now. Individual, rather than generic, and the sensation was so overwhelming I nearly released my grip and surrendered to the fall that would solve all questions with merciful finality. Instead, I forced myself upward through the movement, and as my body compressed into the tight passage, I experienced a vision so vivid it superseded present reality. I saw myself from outside and above, saw my form as the mountain perceived it, saw the heat signature of my body as an irritant against its eternal cold, saw the cellular damage my presence inflicted on microscopic ecosystems in the ice, saw myself as infection, as invasion, as the latest manifestation of a species that had forgotten how to exist within boundaries. The vision expanded, and I saw Sarah and Marcus below, saw our entire expedition as a system of disturbance radiating outward from each camp and cache supply, saw how our presence disrupted patterns of wind and precipitation in ways we had never measured, saw the cumulative effect of decades of expeditions creating micro-changes in ice stability that would cascade into macro consequences we would never witness or accept responsibility for. Then the perspective shifted again, and I saw through the creature's eyes across centuries, watched it emerge again and again to deliver warnings that were ignored or rationalized away, watched it grow more insistent as human presence intensified, watched it make choices about which climbers to warn and which to remove, and I understood that what I had interpreted as monster was actually restraint, was mercy operating at a scale my species-centric worldview could not comprehend. The vision released me so abruptly I gasped and found myself lying on a snow shelf with no memory of how I had arrived there, my cheek pressed against ice that felt warm compared to the cold living inside my chest. And I realized I was weeping, tears freezing on my face as they fell, mourning something I could not articulate because the language for it did not exist in the vocabulary I had been raised with. I mourned the innocence of my earlier self, who had believed that passion and preparation were sufficient justification for standing anywhere I could physically reach. Mourned the simplicity of a worldview where mountains were challenges rather than entities. Mourned the comfortable ignorance that had allowed me to pursue glory without grappling with cost. My radio crackled again. "Marcus, this. Time." His voice tight with barely controlled panic, saying they had found blood on the fixed ropes below the col, asking if I was injured, asking if I could make it to Camp 3 because they were preparing to descend immediately, saying that something had circled their tent all night and they knew now that the villagers had been right, and we needed to leave before the mountain took more than it already had. I wanted to tell him that it was already too late, that the taking had occurred the moment we decided our ambition outweighed their warnings, that we were not escaping but being released, that the difference mattered more than we could understand, but my voice emerged as broken. Whisper that the radio could not transmit, words dissolving into static like prayers sent to gods who had stopped listening because we had stopped deserving their attention. I forced myself upright and continued descending through air that felt increasingly liquid, as if I was moving underwater or through the boundary between states of matter and... Each anchor point I clipped into felt like negotiating permission rather than ensuring safety, felt like the mountain was consciously choosing whether to hold my weight or let me fall. The patch of skin where the creature had touched me had begun changing in ways I could perceive without seeing, could feel the tissue transforming at some fundamental level, cells reorganizing according to patterns that belonged to this place, rather than to the lowland biology I had been born into. I understood with creeping horror that I was being marked, branded with evidence of my encounter, that I would carry this alteration back to the world below as proof and warning, that my body itself was becoming testimony to truths that photographs and expedition reports could never capture. The wind picked up with surgical precision, pushing me toward the correct route when I hesitated, correcting my course when exhaustion made me careless, and I realized the creature had not left me but was present in the mountain's every response was guiding. My descent with the same deliberate care it had shown in its appearance, ensuring I survived to deliver the message it had spent eons trying to communicate to a species that had elevated deafness to virtue and called it courage. I found Marcus at Camp 3 in the grey pre-dawn. His tent collapsed around him like a burial shroud, and when I pulled back the frozen nylon, his body was arranged in a position no living person could achieve, spine arched backward, arms extended toward the summit, face locked in an expression that transcended fear into something approaching ecstasy. His eyes were open, but filmed with ice, and in that crystalline coating I saw reflected not the sky above, but depths, Below, as if in his final moment, he had been granted vision into the mountain's core, and the sight had been too vast for his mind to contain without shattering. There were no marks of violence on him, no blood or torn clothing, just the impossible positioning and that expression of overwhelming recognition, and I understood he had not been attacked, but shown something, had been given the full revelation I had only glimpsed in fragments, and his body had simply ceased functioning because human physiology was not designed to process that magnitude of truth. I knelt beside him in the snow, feeling a jealousy so profound it shamed me, envying that he had been deemed worthy of complete understanding while I had been selected only as messenger, envying that his suffering had ended while mine was being carefully prolonged, envying the mercy of his transformation from person to symbol, from expedition member to eternal warning, frozen in the act of comprehension. Sarah reached camp an hour after sunrise, moving with the mechanical precision of someone whose survival instinct had overridden all other cognitive function. And when she saw Marcus, she made a sound that was not quite scream or sob, but something more primal, the noise a mind makes when reality fractures beyond all possibility of repair. She turned to me with eyes that held accusation and pleading in equal measure, demanding explanation while simultaneously recognizing that no explanation existed within the framework of everything we had believed about how the world functioned. And I watched her face cycle through denial and bargaining and acceptance in the span of seconds that under normal circumstances would have required months of grief processing. She asked me what happened, and I opened my mouth to answer, but found the words rearranging themselves before I could speak them, found myself saying things I had not consciously decided to say, found my voice becoming instrument for something that wanted to be articulated through me rather than by me. I told her about the creature, but heard myself describing it not as monster, but as immune system, not as predator, but as boundary keeper, not as legend, but as consequence made manifest. And I watched her expression shift from horror to understanding to a resignation that aged her features by decades in the span of our conversation, watched her accept that we had not been victims of attack, but participants in a teaching that required sacrifice to achieve sufficient weight. We left Marcus where he lay, because moving him felt like desecration, and because some intuitive knowledge communicated that his position was intentional, that the creature had arranged him as message for whoever came next, had transformed his death into sacred text that would speak more eloquently than any expedition report or official inquiry ever could. Sarah and I descended together through weather that cleared with unnatural precision, as if the mountain was ensuring we had no excuses for failing to reach safety, no ability to claim that elements beyond our control had prevented our survival. And the clarity of that blue sky felt more threatening than any blizzard, because it meant our lives were being consciously preserved rather than accidentally spared. We did not speak during the descent, words having become insufficient for the territory we now inhabited, and the silence between us was dense with shared understanding that our friendship and our former selves had been left somewhere above, along with Marcus, that we were different entities now, reconfigured by exposure to truths that most of our species lived entire lifetimes successfully avoiding. At one point, Sarah stumbled, and I caught her arm, and felt through that contact that she too had been marked, that the transformation spreading through my chest had its mirror in her, and I understood we were being sent back as matched set, as corroborating witnesses whose separate testimonies would align in ways that precluded dismissal as individual delusion. When we finally reached the village 3 days later, moving through the last sections of trail like ghosts haunting our own expedition, the elders were waiting at the settlement entrance, as if our arrival time had been communicated to them through channels that required no technology or messenger service. They looked at us with expressions containing no surprise, only weary recognition, and the oldest among them approached and placed her palm against my chest, where the cold still lived, nodded once, then did the same to Sarah, and I watched her face confirm what I had suspected, that we bore marks invisible to ordinary sight, but perfectly legible to those who knew the mountain's language. She spoke in her dialect, and the young translator who had warned us before we ascended stepped forward reluctantly, his face showing he wished to be anywhere else, and he told us in halting English that we had been permitted to live, but that permission came with obligation, that we were now bound to the mountain as witnesses and wardens, that our survival was not gift but assignment, and that we would spend whatever years remained to us serving as threshold between the world that believed mountains were resources and the reality that mountains were presences, whose patience was not infinite and whose mercy was not weakness but forbearance that could be exhausted. The elder led us to a stone dwelling at the village edge, where smoke rose through a roof opening and prayer flags snapped in the wind like textile conversations with the sky above, and inside the dim interior she gestured for us to sit on woven mats arranged around a fire that burned with wood so old it seemed to have forgotten how to produce heat, offering only light that cast shadows too deliberate in their movement to be accidental. She prepared tea with hands gnarled by decades of mountain weather, each gesture carrying ceremonial weight, and when she finally spoke through the translator, her words arrived not as information, but as recognition of something we already knew in the transformed portions of ourselves that had been rewritten during our time above. She explained that the covenant was older than her grandmother's. Grandmother could remember that the mountain had always chosen certain people to carry its message back to the world of rushing and taking and claiming, that most who were chosen did not survive the choosing, because their hearts were too hardened to accept the breaking required for new understanding to enter. She said that every generation produced those who forgot the sacred boundaries, who treated the peaks as conquest rather than privilege, and every generation the guardian performed its function, removing those who could not learn and marking those who could, sending them back as living warnings that some places were not meant for human ambition but for human humility. The translator's voice cracked as he rendered her words, and I realized he too bore the mark, that perhaps decades earlier he had been where Sarah and I now sat, receiving the same terrible knowledge that transformed survivors into servants. The elder reached forward and pulled aside the collar of my jacket, exposing skin I had not yet examined, and Sarah gasped, and I looked down to see that the cold mark on my chest had spread into patterns too precise to be random, frost-white lines that branched like sacred geography, mapping something between scar and tattoo and brand. And when the elder exposed Sarah's shoulder, I saw she bore identical marks in mirror configuration, as if we had been inscribed by the same hand with the same intention. The elder explained that we would feel the mountain's presence for the rest of our lives, regardless of how far we traveled from this place. That distance was no barrier to the connection that had been forged between our flesh and the stone that had judged us and found us educable rather than irredeemable, that we would know when storms gathered on the peaks and when climbers approached with hearts full of arrogance rather than respect, and that we were to serve as voices speaking on behalf of what could not speak in human language but could certainly act in ways humans understood too late. She said the marks would change with seasons and weather, darkening when the mountain's patience was tested and fading when proper reverence was shown, that our bodies had become instruments measuring the relationship between her people's land and the outside world, that viewed it as playground or proving ground or photograph opportunity, rather than as living presence with its own consciousness and requirements. I felt the truth of this in my bones, which still carried the deep cold, felt how my awareness now extended beyond the limits of my skin into the snow-covered distances, felt threads connecting me to elevations and ice fields I could not see but could somehow sense the way you sense the position of your own limbs in darkness, Sarah was crying silently, tears tracking down her weathered face, and I knew they were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming comprehension, the kind of weeping that comes when you finally understand why your life contained certain patterns of suffering and searching, when you discover that what felt like random pain was actually purposeful preparation. The elder handed us each a cord woven with bells and tokens, explaining these were to be worn so that other villagers would recognize us as boundary keepers, and as she placed the cord around my neck, I felt its weight as both burden and belonging, felt how being marked by something vast and inhuman paradoxically made me more fully human than I had been, when I measured myself only against other humans rather than against mountains and eternities. We stayed in the village through the winter that came early that year, helping with tasks our damaged bodies could still perform, and learning the songs and stories that preserved knowledge older than written language. And gradually I understood that the trauma we had experienced was not ending, but beginning, not wound but initiation into a way of living that most of the modern world had abandoned in favor of convenience and control. Sarah taught English to the village children while I worked with the men maintaining the trails and shrines, and in the evenings we would sit by fires and feel the mountain's presence like a weight on our shoulders or a hand on our backs, a constant reminder that we had been allowed to descend but not to leave, not truly, not in the ways that mattered. Other climbers passed through with their expensive equipment and their plans for summit attempts, and I found myself speaking, words I had not consciously prepared, telling them stories that bypassed their rational defenses and planted seeds of appropriate caution in the fertile ground of their survival instincts. And occasionally I saw someone really hear what I was saying, saw their expression change from dismissive to receptive, and I knew the Guardian worked through me in those moments, reaching down from the heights to touch those who still had enough wisdom to be touched. The translator, whose name was Tenzin and who had been marked 30 years earlier after his own expedition ended in loss, became our guide in this new identity, teaching us how to live with feet in two worlds, teaching us that the haunting we felt was not punishment but calling, and some nights when the wind came down from the peaks, carrying sounds that might have been weather or might have been something else, I felt not fear, but a strange comfort, knowing I was held by something larger than my own small life, knowing my suffering had been given meaning beyond my ability to assign meaning, knowing that being broken by the sacred was a different category of experience than simply being broken. The morning Sarah decided to leave was marked by clouds that hung on the peaks, like thoughts too heavy to rise, and I understood her departure before she spoke it, because the connection forged between us in the heights had not diminished, but deepened during our months of shared recovery and learning. She said she needed to return to her family, to try to explain what could not be explained, to attempt integration of her former life with her transformed self, and I saw in her eyes both hope and recognition that the attempt might be impossible, that those who had not been marked might never fully comprehend those who had, that she might live the rest of her years in isolation, even when surrounded by people who loved her. I helped her pack her few belongings and walked with her to the trail that led down toward roads and transportation and the world of explanations and expectations, and at the last moment she turned and embraced me with strength that belied her diminished frame, and I felt through that contact how the marks on our bodies resonated with each other like tuning forks struck by the same mallet, how we would always be able to find each other regardless of physical distance, because we had been inscribed into the same story, made characters in a narrative larger than individual choice. She whispered that she was afraid of forgetting, afraid that the ordinary world would erode the extraordinary knowledge we had been given, and I told her what Tenzin had told me, that the mountain would not allow us to forget, that the marks would ensure remembrance even when remembrance felt like curse. Rather than blessing, that we had been changed at a level beyond the reach of time or distance or distraction. I watched her descend until she became a speck, and then a memory, and then just a feeling of presence in the middle distance. And then I turned back toward the village and the peaks beyond, toward the life I had not chosen, but had been chosen for, toward the years of service and witness that stretched ahead like a trail disappearing into clouds that might have been weather, or might have been the breath of something patient and eternal and utterly indifferent to human concepts of mercy. Years have passed now, in their strange compressed way, where seasons blend into each other, yet individual moments remain crystalline and permanent, and I live in a shelter I built with my own hands at the tree line where the village lands give way to the high places, where I can see the summit on clear days and feel its presence on clouded ones, where I exist as both hermit and sentinel, visited occasionally by villagers who bring supplies, and climbers who bring skepticism that usually transforms into something else by the time they leave my door. The marks on my chest have become part of my identity, more fundamental than my name, shifting through shades of white and silver, according to patterns I've learned to read like weather signs, darkening when expeditions approach with dangerous hubris and fading when proper rituals are observed. My body transformed into an instrument measuring the relationship between human ambition and sacred boundary. I have become the story I once would have dismissed, the cautionary figure that rational minds explain away until they encounter something that dissolves rationality like salt in endless water, and I have accepted this role not with resignation, but with something approaching peace, understanding that being chosen by the incomprehensible carries responsibilities beyond personal preference or comfort. Sometimes on the clearest nights I wake to find myself standing outside without memory of rising, facing the peaks with arms extended as if receiving transmission or offering supplication. And in those moments I feel the Guardian's attention like weight and warmth simultaneously, feel that I'm being used as a bridge between worlds that were never meant to be separate, but that human forgetfulness has divided. The climbers who ignore my warnings and proceed toward the summit with their GPS and their confidence and their belief that technology has made them invincible. I feel them disappear one by one, feel the exact moment when the mountain judges and finds them wanting, feel their terror spike like temperature changes in my marked flesh, and I add their names to the cairn I maintain outside my shelter, speaking words in a language I do not consciously know, but that emerges from my mouth during these rituals of remembrance and release. Some return, broken and babbling about white shapes and impossible vocalizations, and I take them in and nurse them through the fever that follows encounter, and occasionally one bears the marks, and I know they will stay, will build their own shelter nearby, will join the scattered fellowship of those who have been transformed from climbers into guardians, from seekers into servants. We are a small community, spread across vast distances, connected by scars and purpose, meeting rarely but knowing each other instantly through the recognition that only comes from shared initiation into mysteries that most of humanity has forgotten or explained away. And in our gatherings, we speak of our experiences not as trauma, but as calling, not as damage, but as refinement, understanding that we were melted down and recast into new forms required for new functions. I heard through the network that Sarah lasted 7 years in the ordinary world before the pull became unbearable, that she returned to the mountains and built her shelter on the eastern approach, that we now serve as matching sentinels on opposite sides of the same sacred geography, and knowing she is there, holding her section of the boundary as I hold mine, brings comfort that surprises me with its depth. I have stopped trying to convince the unconvincible or save those determined not to be saved, have learned that the Guardian's pattern includes casualties as necessary as winter includes cold, that some deaths serve purposes beyond individual tragedy, rippling out through families and media and mountaineering culture. to plant seeds of caution that might save dozens or hundreds who never know how close they came to their own reckoning. My role is not prevention, but witness, not rescue, but testimony. And I have grown into this role the way trees grow around obstacles, incorporating what cannot be moved into the shape of continued living. The mountain speaks. Through dreams and through waking visions that have become indistinguishable from each other, shows me its age and its patience and its complete indifference to human timescales and human values, shows me that it will remain long after our species has exhausted itself with taking and claiming and consuming, shows me that the guardian is not a creature but function, not individual but process, the mountain's immune system responding to infection of arrogance and disrespect. I see now that my survival was neither mercy nor curse, but conscription, that I was drafted into service by something that does not recognize concepts like choice or fairness, that operates according to logics older and stranger than human reasoning can comfortably contain, and I have ceased resisting this conscription, have learned that surrender to the vast and inhuman paradoxically enlarges rather than diminishes the human, connects rather than isolates, gives meaning precisely through demanding I release my insistence on meanings I can control. On storm, nights when the wind comes down like the mountain breathing, I stand outside my shelter, wrapped in wool and watchfulness, feeling the guardian moving through the heights above, feeling it patrol and assess and occasionally descend to deliver its adjustments to those who have violated boundaries they did not know existed or chose not to respect. And I'm no longer afraid because fear requires separation between self and threat. And that separation has been erased by the marks that map me as territory rather than trespasser, as part of the mountain's extended body rather than foreign presence to be expelled. I know I will die here eventually, will be found frozen in some position of service or witness, and my body will be carried down by those who come after, who bear their own marks and their own stories of encounter and transformation, and I will be added to the long line of boundary keepers that stretches back beyond record or memory, and someone else will build a shelter near where mine stood, will take up the watching and the warning and the testimony that never convinces enough people, but convinces exactly the number of people it is meant to convince. This is what I have learned in my years of haunted isolation, that is somehow the deepest connection I have ever known, that the world contains presences and intelligences beyond human categories, that some places are not meant for human triumph but for human humility, that being broken by the sacred and remade into its instrument is not tragedy but transformation, and that I would not undo my choice to climb even knowing the cost, because the cost became the gift. And the gift was discovering I was never separate from the mountain, but always part of it, just waiting to be claimed. What would you do if the mountain chose you? Subscribe for more stories that haunt the boundary between myth and memory.